Please, Horny, I'm very sorry. Just give me a second chance.
Never again. It is too late for you.
The first thing the neighbors heard was his laughter, loud, careless, and deliberately cruel, cutting through the quiet of a bright Lagos afternoon. The kind of laughter meant to announce victory. A rideshare car idled at the edge of the long driveway as the gate swung open, revealing polished tiles, trimmed hedges, and the mansion he had once sworn would always be his. He stepped out dragging a black suitcase behind him, shoulders loose with confidence, while a woman in a tight, shouty red dress clung to his arm like a prize already claimed. Before anyone could speak, he raised his voice for the street to hear. He said he had returned from enjoying life to finally disgrace the useless wife who couldn't give him a child, the woman who had embarrassed him with silence and failure. Heads peeked from behind curtains. Security guards stiffened. And standing a few steps ahead of them, walking calmly toward the house without turning around, was Sola. She did not run. She did not argue. She did not beg. Sola walked with her back straight and her face unreadable, as if none of the words behind her had landed. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman already defeated, plain, modestly dressed, quiet in a world that rewarded noise. What no one there knew. What her husband could not imagine as he strutted behind her with humiliation ready on his tongue, was that Sola was no longer the woman he had left months earlier crying into unpaid bills and whispered insults from relatives. 3 months ago, alone in a hospital corridor, trembling and nauseous, Sola had heard words that changed everything. And from that moment on, she stopped waiting to be rescued. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about preparation, about patience, and about the dangerous mistake of humiliating someone who has already outgrown you in silence. Before we continue, take a moment and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe quiet strength always wins in the end, tap the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Stay with me, because when the truth finally reveals itself, it will not shout, it will simply stand. Zainab Adeyemi had learned very early that survival, for a woman like her, did not come from resistance. It came from reduction, from learning how to take up less space than the room allowed, from lowering her voice before anyone asked, from smiling before questions turned sharp. In public, she was everything people praised in a wife, soft-spoken, composed, always standing half a step behind her husband at gatherings, eyes lowered just enough to signal respect. Elders nodded approvingly when they spoke of her. Neighbors called her well-trained. Church women whispered that she was patient, long-suffering, God-fearing. No one ever asked what patience was costing her. In private, patience was not a virtue. It was a condition imposed. Dare Adeyemi did not raise his voice often. He didn't need to. Control did not come from shouting. It came from certainty. From deciding what Zainab wore before she opened her wardrobe. From commenting casually on how a dress made her look too ambitious. From asking why she needed to attend a meeting or who exactly she planned to see. From taking her phone at night and scrolling through messages with the bored confidence of a man inspecting property he owned. When she protested, even gently, the word disrespect was deployed like a verdict. Disrespect was his favorite accusation. Disrespect justified silence. Disrespect justified punishment. Zainab adjusted. She always did. She learned when to speak and when silence was safer. She learned how to read the atmosphere of a room before opening her mouth. She learned how to keep her face calm even when humiliation crept under her skin. When the insults about her childlessness came, sometimes in jokes, sometimes in outright blame, she absorbed them quietly. 8 years without a child had turned her body into public property. Relatives discussed her womb freely. Prayer sessions were organized for her, without asking. Herbal mixtures were forced into her hands by well-meaning aunties. Dare watched all of it with a detached disappointment that hurt more than anger would have. What no one saw was what Zainab did after the house went quiet. When Dare slept, she worked. When he traveled, she planned. When he assumed she was idle, she was calculating. Zainab had learned early that intelligence, when visible, provoked hostility. So she buried hers. She studied contracts late at night, cross-checking clauses, learning the language of leverage and risk. She attended online meetings with her camera off, voice low, always introduced by intermediaries who never used her full name. She negotiated deals through proxies, signed documents digitally, moved money carefully through accounts Dare never bothered to ask about because he believed he understood finance better than she ever could. She hid her intelligence the way she hid bruises. Deliberately, strategically, with precision. Dare liked to believe he was the engine of their household. He bragged openly about the mansion, the cars, the lifestyle. He spoke of my house and my investments with the easy arrogance of a man who had never read the fine print of anything he signed. Years earlier, when he needed guarantor backing for a loan, he had pushed documents across the table to Zainab without explanation, impatient, dismissive. She signed then without question, because at that time, obedience felt safer than curiosity. But she remembered. Zainab always remembered. Even her pregnancy, when it finally happened, was treated as something to protect, not celebrate. The hospital corridor had been cold that day, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose as she sat alone, palms sweating, heart racing. When the doctor spoke, gently, carefully, Zainab felt something shift deep inside her. Relief came first, then fear, then clarity. She did not call Dare. She did not tell her mother. She told no one except the doctors. Not because she was ashamed, but because she understood something fundamental about power. Information once released could never be reclaimed. She carried her pregnancy the same way she carried everything else, quietly. She chose clothes that concealed rather than announced. She scheduled appointments during hours Dare never noticed. She listened carefully to medical advice and followed it with the same discipline she applied to her work. The child growing inside her became both a promise and a responsibility. This life would not inherit chaos. This life would not be used as proof, as leverage, or as apology. Silence, for now, was still the price of survival. When Dare finally left, storming out of the mansion in a fury after yet another argument about her failure as a woman, Zainab did not chase him. She did not cry publicly. She sat on the edge of the bed long after the door slammed and listened to the quiet settle. That quiet felt different. Heavy, yes, but also clean. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like a stage where she had to perform humility to avoid punishment. It felt like space. The letter from the bank arrived 2 weeks later. She read it slowly, carefully twice. Foreclosure notice. Missed payments. Deadlines Dare had ignored while spending freely on vacations and indulgences. For a moment, panic rose. Then training took over. Zainab did not scream. She did not call him. She opened a folder she had kept hidden beneath old documents and began to cross-reference numbers, dates, clauses. She made calls. She asked questions. She listened more than she spoke. That was when she fully understood how deeply Dare had underestimated her. The mansion, the symbol of his pride, was not as untouchable as he believed. The ownership structure was fragile. The debts were real. And her name, quietly placed in places he had never bothered to look, carried weight. With guidance from an estate agent who saw not weakness, but resolve in her eyes, Zainab began the process. Negotiations were calm. Decisions were deliberate. She did not rush. She did not gloat. She sold the property legally, transparently, and used the proceeds to clear debts Dare had pretended did not exist. She set aside funds for her child. She secured a modest apartment where no one raised their voice at her. The only thing she kept from the mansion was the gate key. By the time Dare returned months later, loud, triumphant, dragging a suitcase and a woman in red behind him, Zainab was no longer surviving by shrinking. She was simply waiting. Waiting for the moment preparation would meet arrogance. Waiting for silence to do what shouting never could. And as she walked calmly ahead of him toward the house he believed still belonged to him, Zainab knew one truth with absolute certainty. The most dangerous people were not the loud ones. They were the ones who learned to endure quietly until endurance was no longer necessary. The hospital room was supposed to be neutral ground. That was what Zainab had told herself as she lay back against the raised bed, eyes tracing the thin crack in the ceiling paint above her. White walls. Clean sheets. The soft, rhythmic beeping of a monitor that counted her heartbeat and the quieter, steadier one that reassured her the baby was still there. Nurses moved in and out with practiced calm, their voices low, their steps measured. For a few hours, the world had shrunk to instructions, observations, and the simple act of breathing slowly through waves of nausea and fear. It was not comfort exactly, but it was safety or close enough to feel like it. She was still weak when the door opened without a knock. Zainab did not need to look up to know who it was. She recognized the weight of his presence before she saw his face, the way the air in a room seemed to tighten around Der Adeyemi, as though space itself learned to brace. The door closed behind him with a deliberate click. Not slammed. Closed. The sound landed heavily, final, sealing the room off from the corridor where nurses chatted softly and carts rolled past. Der stood there for a moment, eyes scanning the space, as if assessing whether it met his standards. He did not ask how she felt. He did not glance at the monitors. He did not look at her stomach. "What is this nonsense?" he said instead, his voice sharp and controlled, the kind of anger he reserved for moments when he believed he had the upper hand. "Hospital again? Do you know how this makes me look?" Zainab shifted slightly, wincing as discomfort flared low in her abdomen. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. Experience had taught her that explanations were invitations. Der did not want reasons. He wanted compliance. "I was called out of a meeting because of you," he continued, pacing once across the narrow space between the bed and the window. "People are asking questions. Complications. Weakness. Always something. Do you think investors like stories like this?" The words came quickly now, practiced, layered with accusation. He spoke as though her body were an inconvenience she had chosen, a disruption deliberately staged to embarrass him. Zainab stared at her hands instead, fingers resting lightly on the blanket, and focused on keeping her breathing even. She reminded herself of what the doctor had said. "Stay calm. Avoid stress. Protect the baby." Der stopped pacing. She felt him closer before she looked up. He stood at the side of the bed, gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. His eyes did not carry concern. They carried calculation. "You're going to fix this," he said. From inside his jacket, he pulled out a neatly folded envelope and placed it on the bed beside her hand, right where she could not ignore it. The paper looked heavy even before she touched it. Der smoothed it flat with his palm, a proprietary gesture, as though arranging something that already belonged to him. "Sign," he said. Zainab glanced down, her stomach sinking. She recognized the formatting instantly. The language. The spacing. This was not a medical form. This was corporate. Share transfer documents. Carefully drafted, professionally printed. He had not brought these on impulse. He had planned this moment. "What is this?" she asked quietly, though she already knew. "For the family," Der replied without hesitation. "Temporary restructuring. My lawyers advised it. You don't need to understand the details." Zainab's fingers trembled as she picked up the first page. The words swam slightly at first, blurred by fatigue, then sharpened into clarity. Transfer of controlling shares. Immediate effect. Her name appeared where she had worked hard to place it, then vanished in the next line, replaced by his. It was clean. Efficient. Permanent. "You want me to give you everything," she said. Der exhaled sharply, impatience flickering across his face. "Don't be dramatic. You're sick. You're emotional. This is for stability. For us." The word us felt hollow as it landed between them. Zainab looked back at the document. She thought of the nights she had spent learning the language on those pages, the meetings she had attended in silence, the deals that bore her fingerprints even when her name was hidden. She thought of the child growing inside her, unaware of any of this, trusting her completely. A calm settled over her. Not peace, but clarity. "No," she said. The word was soft, barely louder than the machines behind her, but it cut the room cleanly in two. Dare stared at her, disbelief flashing across his face before hardening into something darker. "What did you say?" "I said no." For a moment, the room went very still. Even the beeping seemed louder in the pause that followed.
Dare SJ tightened.
He leaned closer, placing one hand on the bed rail, the metal creaking softly under his grip. "Don't start this," he said, his voice low now. "Dangerous. You know what happens when you start this." Zainab met his gaze then, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm not signing," she said again. "Not here. Not ever." His reaction was immediate. The composure cracked. His voice rose, sharp and cutting, filling the small room as though volume alone could force submission. "You are nothing without me," he snapped. "Do you hear me? Nothing. All of this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the company, the life he believed he controlled. "Exists because I allow it." Zainab felt her pulse quicken, a warning flutter low in her body. She placed one hand instinctively over her stomach, a small, protective motion she could not stop. Dare noticed it and scoffed. "Don't act weak now," he said. "You want to embarrass me with this drama and still think you can say no?" The air felt heavier with every word. The room that had once felt sterile and safe now seemed to close in on itself, walls inching closer, ceiling pressing down. Zainab's mouth felt dry, but her mind remained clear. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply held the document out slightly, away from her. "I won't sign," she said. Something in Dare snapped. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, the moment anger tipped into something else. He straightened abruptly, his hand lifting before Zainab fully understood what was happening. The sound of the strike landed sharp and loud in the small space, followed by the sudden, frantic spike of the monitor. Pain exploded across her cheek, bright and disorienting. Zainab cried out, her body curling instinctively as she shielded her stomach with both arms. For half a second, Dare froze. Then reality rushed back in. The machines, the noise, the implications. His face rearranged itself into something resembling concern, his hands lifting as if in alarm. "What did you do?" he said sharply, not to himself, but to her, as though she were responsible for what had just happened. Footsteps sounded outside the door. The hospital room, once a trap, was no longer sealed. And as Zainab struggled to steady her breathing, tasting blood at the corner of her mouth, one truth became painfully clear. Dare had believed this room would protect him. He had believed white walls and quiet corridors would hide his cruelty. He was wrong. The first knock on the door came fast, urgent, followed by a second that did not wait for permission. The monitor beside Zainab's bed beeped louder, sharper, a rapid warning that cut through the antiseptic quiet like an alarm bell in a church. Zainab blinked hard, trying to steady the room that tilted at the edges. Her cheek burned. Her ears rang. Her arms stayed wrapped around her stomach like a shield, instinct overriding pain, overriding pride, overriding everything. Dare moved before the door opened. Not toward her. Toward the narrative. He stepped back from the bed, palms lifting in a practiced gesture of alarm. His face shifted, rearranging itself quickly, anger pushed behind his eyes, replaced with a look that could be mistaken for worry if someone didn't know him. He glanced at the papers on the bed, then snatched them up, folding them fast as if the ink itself could testify. The door swung open and a nurse stepped in, followed by another, their expressions tightening as they took in the scene. Zainab's breathing was uneven. Her cheek was swelling. Her eyes were wet not with drama, but with the involuntary response of pain. The monitor's line jerked with agitation. "What happened?" the first nurse demanded, already moving closer, gloved hands reaching for Zainab's face, her stomach, the monitor, everything at once. Dare spoke first, smoothly, quickly. She got dizzy," he said, voice trembling in all the right places. "She panicked. She tried to sit up too fast." I was just trying to calm her down. The lie came out effortless, like a habit. Zainab stared at him. Her throat tightened. The injustice of hearing him talk about calm, while her skin still stung from his hand, made something cold move through her chest. But she stayed still. She knew how this worked. Dare loved chaos when he could control it. He wanted her disoriented, emotional, easy to label hysterical. The nurse's gaze moved from Dare to Zainab and back again. She was trained to observe. She saw the swelling already forming, the way Zainab's jaw clenched when she tried to speak, the paper edge peeking from Dare's hand, the unnatural tension in the room. "Madam," the nurse said, leaning closer so Zainab could see her face clearly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Zainab swallowed. Every word felt heavy. Her cheek throbbed. Her pulse hammered at her temples. She wanted to say it plainly. "He hit me." But fear rose immediately behind that sentence. Not fear of Dare alone. Fear of what followed when a woman spoke truth in spaces where men believed the truth belonged to them. Fear of being blamed. Fear of being dismissed. Dare's voice slid in again, soft now, coaxing. "Don't stress yourself," he murmured, as if he cared. "Tell them you're fine. You know the baby's stress is not good." It was the oldest trick he had. Turn her protection into his weapon. Zainab's fingers tightened over her stomach. She stared at the nurse, and something in the woman's eyes steadied her. It wasn't pity. It was attention. The kind of attention that didn't look away. "I refuse to sign," Zainab said quietly. The words came out before she could stop them. Not the whole truth, but enough to crack the surface. The nurse paused. "Sign what?" Dare's expression flickered, irritation flashing for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it again. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "Just family documents." She's not thinking clearly. But the nurse had already reached for the bed, her eyes catching the imprint of a page corner, the corporate formatting, the bold headings. She didn't read everything. She didn't need to. She recognized enough to understand this wasn't about medical care. This was about pressure. Zainab's breathing eased slightly as the nurses adjusted the monitor, checked her vitals, asked about pain levels, evaluated the baby's heartbeat. Their movements were efficient, focused. The room filled with clinical calm, and for a moment, Dare seemed irritated that he was no longer the center of it. He hovered, trying to reclaim control with small comments. "She always overreacts. She's been under stress. You know women in pregnancy." The nurse ignored the commentary and spoke directly to Zainab again. "Did you fall?" she asked, voice firm, eyes steady. Zainab held her gaze. "No," she whispered. The second nurse, standing near the doorway, had been silent until now. She spoke quietly to her colleague, using the kind of coded professional tone that meant action without announcement. The first nurse nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped toward the door. "Sir," she said to Dare, still polite, still professional, "please step outside for a moment. We need to examine her properly." Dare's eyes narrowed. "I'm her husband, and we need privacy," the nurse repeated, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Dare's chest lifted, his posture tightening, ready to assert dominance. Then he noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The faint red light above the door frame. A small camera. He stared at it, and his confidence faltered, just slightly. He stepped out. The door closed again, but this time it did not feel like a trap. It felt like protection. The nurse turned back to Zainab. Her voice softened. "Madam," she said, "tell me the truth. Did he hit you?" Zainab's lips parted. Her eyes burned. She wanted to speak, but years of silence did not unravel easily. Years of survival had taught her that truth was dangerous if it was not backed by something stronger than words. The monitor beeped steadily now, the baby's heartbeat a thin line of reassurance. Zainab swallowed hard and nodded once. "Yes," she said. The room seemed to sharpen. The nurse's face did not change dramatically, but something in her expression shifted into resolve. She looked at the other nurse, and they moved into procedure, documenting injuries, noting the swelling pattern, recording Zainab's statement with careful neutrality. Their pens scratched quietly against paper. Their questions were precise. Was he trying to make you sign? Has this happened before? Are you safe at home? Zainab answered what she could. Not everything. Not yet. But enough for a record to exist. Outside the door, Dare's voice rose faintly, impatient. Is she okay? He called out, too loud, too performative. The nurse opened the door just a crack and stepped into the corridor, her body blocking his view. We're stabilizing her, she said evenly. Please wait. Dare leaned forward, trying to see past her. I need to be there. We'll call you, she replied, and closed the door again. He didn't realize the small decisions being made in that corridor, the quiet call to hospital security, the quick request for camera timestamps, the subtle shift from ordinary care to protected observation. He didn't realize the alarm that had sounded was not only medical. It was procedural. It had drawn attention. It had created witnesses. It had started a paper trail. Back inside, Zainab lay still as the nurse adjusted her pillow, offering water, keeping her voice gentle. The tenderness almost broke her, because she was used to tenderness being a lie that came after harm. This tenderness was different. It was steady. It asked for nothing in return. Zainab stared at the ceiling again, blinking away tears she refused to let fall freely. She thought of the documents Dare had brought. She thought of the way his hand moved without hesitation. She thought of how quickly he had tried to rewrite reality the moment the door opened. And she understood something with painful clarity. Dare had not hit her because he lost control. He hit her because he believed he had it. He believed the hospital would hide him. He believed staff would stay silent. He believed she would stay silent. But the alarm had already done what alarms were meant to do. It had called people in. It had made noise. It had made the invisible visible. And somewhere beyond the corridor, behind hospital systems and protocols Dare didn't bother to understand, the first pieces of his downfall were already being saved. The nurse returned with a different kind of focus. Not rushed, not alarmed, but alert. The sort of alertness that came from years of experience, from learning how to read rooms the way others read faces. She paused just inside the doorway, eyes sweeping the space in a single practice motion. Zainab's cheek was visibly swollen now, the skin tight and warm beneath the light. Her breathing had steadied, but her voice still carried a faint tremor when she answered questions. Dare stood too close to the bed, hovering, hands restless, speaking before anyone finished a sentence. He was explaining. Too much. Too quickly. She's been under pressure, he said, his voice slipping into a rehearsed concern that sounded convincing only to people who didn't listen closely. Work stress. Hormones. You know how these things are. She panics easily. The nurse nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. Her gaze dropped briefly to the bed, to the papers lying there, creased now, one corner peeking from beneath the blanket where Dare had failed to hide them completely. The formatting caught her eye first. Bold headings. Dense paragraphs. Signature lines. This was not the kind of document that belonged in a maternity ward. What's that? She asked, pointing lightly. Dare reacted a fraction of a second too late. He reached for the papers, fingers closing around them with unnecessary force. Nothing important, he said quickly. Just family matters. The nurse held his gaze, her expression neutral. May I see it? No, Dare replied, then softened immediately. I mean, there's really no need. She shouldn't be stressed with paperwork right now. That was when the nurse's attention sharpened fully. Stress was the word men like Dare used when they wanted to erase context. She turned back to Zainab, lowering her voice slightly, not to whisper, but to create a boundary. Madam, she said, were you asked to sign something today? Zainab hesitated. She could feel Dare's presence like pressure against her skin, his expectation that she would minimize, deflect, smooth things over the way she always had. The habit of endurance tugged at her instinctively, but something had shifted. The pain in her cheek, the steady rhythm of the baby's heartbeat, the quiet competence of the nurse standing there, it all grounded her. Yes, Zainab said simply. The nurse extended her hand, palm open, not demanding. Zainab reached for the document slowly and passed it over. Dare's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The nurse scanned the first page, then the second. Her eyes moved quickly, recognizing the language immediately. Share transfer. Controlling interest. Immediate effect. This was not love. This was leverage. The nurse did not react outwardly. She handed the document back to Zainab and placed it gently on the bedside table, far from Dare's reach. "I'm going to get the doctor," she said evenly. "Please remain seated."
Dare coughed softly.
"You're making this bigger than it is." But the nurse was already gone. The doctor arrived minutes later, calm and methodical, carrying a tablet and a clipboard. He introduced himself, then turned his full attention to Zainab. His questions were precise, clinical, and quietly thorough. He examined her cheek, noting the swelling pattern, the tenderness, the angle of impact. He checked her vitals, monitored the baby's heartbeat, documented everything carefully. "Can you describe how this injury occurred?" he asked. Zainab closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. She did not embellish. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She spoke as if recounting a fact already settled in her mind. "He struck me," she said, "with his hand, while I was lying down." The doctor paused only long enough to record the statement. "What led to that?" "He wanted me to sign documents," Zainab replied. "I refused." Dare laughed sharply, an edge of irritation slicing through his composure. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're going to turn a family disagreement into a case?" The doctor did not look at him. He continued typing. "Sir," he said without lifting his eyes, "I'll need you to step outside. I'm her husband." "And this is a medical assessment," the doctor replied calmly. "Please." This time, Dare hesitated longer. His authority, which usually filled rooms effortlessly, felt strangely diminished here. He glanced at the nurse standing by the door, at the doctor focused on his notes, at the quiet certainty with which the space no longer revolved around him. With a tight smile, he stepped back. As the door closed, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. The doctor turned fully toward Zainab again. "Has anything like this happened before?" he asked. Zainab inhaled slowly. This question was heavier than the others. It carried the weight of years she had tried to compartmentalize. She thought of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of apologies that came wrapped in gifts, of silence that had been mistaken for forgiveness. "Yes," she said. The doctor nodded, documenting carefully. The nurse stood nearby, her presence steady, grounding. Each answer Zainab gave was written down without judgment, without commentary. Just facts.
Times.
Descriptions. Patterns. What Dare had intended as a private act of control was unraveling into something else entirely. A record. A trail. A narrative that did not rely on persuasion or emotion. Medical notes became evidence. The nurse returned briefly to the corridor, speaking quietly to someone Zainab couldn't see. When she came back, her tone was unchanged, but the decisions she carried with her were heavier. Zainab noticed the subtle shift, the way the nurse positioned herself closer to the bed, the way the door was left slightly ajar, not closed. Dare knocked once, then opened the door without waiting. "Are we done?" he asked, irritation seeping through the mask. "She needs rest." The nurse stepped forward, blocking his path without touching him. "We're still assessing," she said. "Please wait." Dare stared at her, disbelief flickering across his face. No one had spoken to him like this in a long time. He looked past her toward Zainab, expecting something, compliance, perhaps. She met his gaze calmly. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The doctor finished his examination and turned the tablet so Zainab could see the summary, explaining next steps, reassuring her about the baby, outlining observation plans. He spoke with care, not urgency, but his professionalism carried weight. This was no longer something that could be dismissed as hysteria or misunderstanding. When Dare was finally allowed back in, his posture had changed. He stood farther from the bed now, hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes darting to the tablet, the clipboard, the nurse. He tried once more to regain control with words. "We'll handle this privately," he said. "There's no need to involve anyone else." The nurse smiled politely. "Sir," she replied, "this is no longer private." Dare's confidence cracked then, not enough to shatter, but enough to show the fractures. He nodded stiffly, said nothing more, and sat down heavily in the chair by the wall. Zainab lay back against the pillows, exhaustion settling into her bones. She felt no triumph.
No vindication.
Only a quiet, steady awareness that something irreversible had begun. The truth, delivered without drama, without shouting, had a force all its own. And Dare, watching the room slip beyond his control, still didn't realize how much ground he had already lost. Dare left the room again after the doctor finished documenting, but he didn't leave the floor. He hovered in the corridor like a man who had misplaced something important and was determined to find it before anyone else did. His shoulders were tight. His jaw worked as if he were chewing anger. Every few seconds his eyes flicked toward the nurse's station, then back to Zainab's door, then down the hallway where people moved in steady hospital rhythm, orderlies pushing carts, visitors walking softly, staff speaking in low professional tones. The calm of the hospital offended him. It made his violence look exactly like what it was: unnecessary, ugly, small. He tried to reclaim control the way he always did, with pressure. "Let's not make this complicated," he told the nurse who had first responded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You people see plenty of things. You know how these matters go. Handle it quietly." The nurse didn't argue. She didn't react dramatically. She simply looked at him for a moment with a kind of tired clarity that made him shift uncomfortably. Then she turned away to continue her work, as if his request had been filed into the same category as every other unreasonable demand she'd heard from entitled people.
Dare smiled in.
He moved closer to the station, lowering his voice as if secrecy depended on volume. "Who recorded anything?" he asked. "I saw some of you holding phones." No one answered. He leaned over the counter, eyes sharp now, voice tightening. "I'm warning you, mind your jobs. Don't let small mistakes destroy your future." The threat was familiar. It was the kind of threat that usually worked outside these walls, in spaces where money and fear could rewrite stories. Here, it landed differently. The nurses did not freeze. They did not scramble to appease him. They continued typing, charting, checking schedules, moving with the quiet confidence of people protected by protocol. Because while Dare was busy trying to intimidate the visible, something invisible had already begun. In a small room 2 corridors away, behind a door marked security, a monitor displayed the hospital's live camera feeds in silent rows. A security officer sat with a headset resting around his neck, scrolling through timestamps with steady hands. There was no drama in his movements.
No shock.
Just routine. Alarms had gone off in a monitored room. A patient had been flagged for potential domestic violence. That triggered a chain. Chains did not require emotion. Chains required procedure. He rewound the footage. The corridor camera showed Dare arriving fast, shoulders forward, posture aggressive. It captured the way he reached the door without knocking, the way he stepped into the room like it was his property. Minutes later, it captured the alarm response. Nurses moving quickly, one running, another calling for backup. It captured Dare's delayed movement in the corridor, not urgent, not panicked, but calculated, his body language shifting only when he realized attention was coming. Security didn't need to guess. Cameras told time truthfully. Another feed, from inside the room, showed blurred shapes and sudden motion, raised voices, a sharp movement near the bed, Zainab's body curling defensively. It did not show everything with perfect clarity, but it showed enough. It showed force. It showed distress. It showed immediacy. Most importantly, it showed sequence. The officer tagged the clips and saved them, not to a phone, not to a flash drive that could be snatched, but to the hospital's secure server system.
Auto backup.
Encrypted storage. Restricted access. The kind of system built for exactly this, because hospitals learned long ago that some people would try to erase what happened inside their walls. A second officer confirmed the save, cross-checking timestamps, creating a record that couldn't be edited without leaving digital fingerprints. No one called Dare to inform him. No one needed to. Protocol moved quietly. It didn't care who he was. Back in the corridor, Dare's irritation grew because nothing was responding to his dominance. He tried again, choosing a younger nurse this time, one he assumed would be easier to intimidate. "I'll advise you," he said, voice low. "Delete whatever you think you have. This isn't your matter." The nurse blinked, then looked up calm. "Sir," she said, not unkindly, "we don't control the cameras." Dare's eyes narrowed. "Then who does?" She didn't answer. She turned back to her screen, typing. He felt it then, the first real sting of uncertainty. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the unsettling sensation of a man realizing he might not be able to force reality to bend. He walked back toward Zainab's room and pushed the door open without knocking. Zainab lay still, her face turned slightly away, the swelling more pronounced now. The nurse was adjusting her foreline. The doctor's notes sat on the bedside table. Evidence in plain sight. Dare's voice dropped into a gentler tone, one he used when witnesses were near. "Zainab," he said softly, as if he hadn't been the source of her pain. "Why are you doing this? Why are you letting them make a big case? Think of the baby." Zainab's eyes moved to him slowly. Her gaze was calm, almost tired. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply looked at him the way one looks at a person they finally see clearly. The nurse spoke before Zainab could. "Sir, she needs rest," she said, firm. "Please step out." Dare stared at the nurse, then at Zainab, as if expecting her to correct the nurse, to reinforce his authority. Zainab said nothing. That silence, different from her old silence, was what unsettled him most. It was not submissive. It was detached. Dare stepped out again, breathing sharply through his nose, and returned to the corridor. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, voice tight with force control. "Get someone," he said into the receiver. "I need this handled.
Now."
But the hospital didn't wait for his connections to arrive. Systems didn't pause for influence. In administration, a notification had already been triggered, flagged, and routed. A senior staff member received the incident report with attached timestamps. The file included notes: patient injury observed, partner present, coercive documents involved, CCTV secured. It was neat, clinical, unemotional. That's what made it powerful. Dare didn't understand that his biggest mistake wasn't striking Zainab. It was assuming he could erase the moment afterward. By the time he realized the corridor had cameras and the room had monitoring, he was already too late. The footage was no longer something he could bargain for. It had become part of a system designed to protect patients from exactly the kind of man who believed power meant impunity. And so control began to leave his hands, not with shouting, not with confrontation, not with a dramatic announcement, but with quiet clicks of saved files, locked timestamps, and protocol doing what it was built to do. Zainab's world narrowed again to the bed, the beeping machines and the steady, careful hands that moved around her with professional calm. The doctor pressed gently along her abdomen, asking questions in a voice designed not to alarm. The nurse checked her blood pressure, adjusted the foreline, watched the monitor like it was a language she understood fluently. Zainab answered when she could, quietly, holding on to the rhythm of breathing that kept her from spiraling. Pain sat in her cheek like heat trapped under skin. Fear lived in her stomach, not for herself, but for the small heartbeat that kept insisting on life. Outside the door, Dare's voice rose and fell in the corridor, trying to bargain with the air. Zainab could hear the faint edge of it through the walls, the same voice that had once convinced her to doubt her own reality. But inside the room, his influence felt weaker. The staff did not bend to him. The machines did not lie for him. The hospital's quiet order held, firm and indifferent to his ego. Then Zainab's phone vibrated once. It was a small sound, almost nothing. A soft buzz against the bedside table. But it cut through everything because she recognized it. Not the sound itself, but what it meant. The phone was on silent, it only vibrated for one category of message. One channel. One person. Her assistant. The nurse glanced at the phone and then back at Zainab, ready to continue her checks. Zainab reached for it slowly, fingers steady despite the tremor in her body. The screen lit up. A single message. Deal finalized. $200 billion. All signatures confirmed. For a moment, Zainab simply stared. Not because she didn't understand. Because she understood too well. Relief moved through her in a slow wave, heavier than triumph, deeper than excitement. Her eyes closed briefly, not in celebration, but in release. A kind of quiet release that said, "It is done. It is secured. It cannot be taken." The doctor spoke again, asking if she felt dizzy. The nurse asked about pain levels. Zainab nodded faintly and set the phone down, face composed. She did not announce the message. She did not smile. She did not gasp. Zainab had learned that power did not always need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes power was safest when it stayed inside your chest, controlled and private. The timing was not accident. Nothing in Zainab's life had been accidental for a long time. Weeks earlier, while her pregnancy still felt like a fragile secret and Dare still believed she was too emotional to manage serious decisions, Zainab had predicted this day. She had planned for it. The final signatures on the deal. An energy and infrastructure agreement so massive it would shift markets and budgets had been scheduled for a specific window. Government representatives, corporate executives, legal teams, international partners. Every last one of them waiting for a final go-ahead that only one person could give. Zainab. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, the deal belonged to a board, to a holding company, to a consortium of names and logos that looked impressive on paper. The kind of structure designed to protect assets and discourage predators. But underneath the structure, under the shell companies and nominees and carefully placed representatives, was one quiet architect who had built the entire thing from the bones up. Zainab had become that architect in the same way she became everything else, quietly. While Dare was busy performing wealth and masculinity, Zainab had been building influence. She had learned to read people the way she read contracts. She understood greed, pride, fear, and ego. She knew how to let men talk themselves into revealing their weaknesses. She knew how to wait, how to make silence uncomfortable for others while she remained calm. She negotiated not with noise, but with certainty. She did not chase. She positioned. It started years ago with smaller deals, discreet partnerships, quiet investments that Dare dismissed because he could not see the shine. Then one opportunity became two. Two became networks. Networks became leverage. And leverage became the kind of power that did not need to announce itself because it was already moving behind the scenes. This $200 billion deal was not just money. It was control of future, energy routes, infrastructure contracts, long-term commitments that would ripple across cities and villages, affecting jobs, development, and influence. The kind of deal that made politicians careful and executives respectful. The kind of deal that brought powerful people into rooms with softened voices. And Dare had no idea. In his mind, Zainab was a quiet wife. A woman who needed him. A woman he could corner on a hospital bed and force into signing away her stake. A woman he could strike and then rewrite the story with charm and intimidation. He did not know that while he was threatening nurses in a corridor, emails were being stamped and archived, signatures verified, transfers confirmed. He did not know that global systems had already clicked into place, banking confirmations, legal acknowledgements, corporate filings, because Zainab's final approval had been embedded into the process long before she stepped into the hospital. He did not know that as she lay bleeding, the world was shaking hands over her name. Zainab's phone vibrated again. Another message, shorter this time. "They're coming to see you."
Her assistant always wrote like that. Direct.
Efficient.
No unnecessary emotion.
It meant executives, lawyers, security, people who moved with purpose, people who did not show up without preparation. Zainab placed the phone face down and inhaled slowly. For the first time since Dare entered the room, her body felt less helpless. The pain remained. The fear for her baby remained. But something else rose quietly beneath it, a steadiness anchored in the knowledge that she was not trapped in a story. The nurse checked the monitor again and nodded, speaking softly about stability. The doctor finished his notes and reassured her that they were keeping close watch. Zainab listened, eyes steady, mind moving in two worlds at once, the private world of her body and the larger world of consequence unfolding outside this room. In the corridor, Dare paced. His steps were uneven now. His calls were not producing immediate solutions. He did not understand why the hospital staff looked at him differently. He didn't understand why he couldn't bully his way back into control. He thought the worst part was the documentation and the CCTV. He didn't realize those were only the beginning. Because the moment the deal closed, Zainab stopped being a woman he could privately harm without consequence. She became a person connected to systems with teeth. Legal teams. Corporate security. People who treated risk like a disease and acted swiftly to contain it. And Dare, still intoxicated by the idea that he was the master of her life, was standing on the edge of a cliff he could not see, one step away from the moment his lies would collide with the truth of who Zainab really was. Zainab's eyes drifted toward the door. She heard distant footsteps in the corridor, measured, purposeful, not rushed. The kind of footsteps that sounded like arrival, not reaction. She kept her face calm. She kept her breathing slow. She kept her hands lightly resting over her stomach, as if reminding herself, and the world, what mattered most. Then she waited, quietly, because she had learned that the loudest turning points often arrived without noise. The hospital corridor changed before anyone announced it. It wasn't obvious at first. There were no sirens, no raised voices, no dramatic emotion. It began with small things. Security officers repositioning themselves near the elevators, a senior administrator walking faster than usual with a tablet held tight to her chest, nurses lowering their voices as if the air itself had become more serious. The building still smelled the same. The fluorescent lights still hummed. But the rhythm shifted, subtle and unmistakable, like a room that senses important people are about to enter. Zainab noticed it from her bed. She heard the footsteps, measured, controlled, not the hurried gait of hospital staff responding to an emergency, but the deliberate pace of people arriving with purpose. She kept her eyes on the ceiling, breathing steadily, letting the nurse adjust her pillows, letting the doctor finish another quick check. Her cheeks still throbbed. The swelling was worse now, but her expression remained composed. She had learned long ago that composure was not denial.
It was discipline.
Outside her door, Dare hovered. He had stopped pacing, but he couldn't sit still. He kept checking his phone, tapping it too hard, making calls that ended quickly, frustration sharpening his tone. Every time a nurse walked past him without acknowledging his presence, his irritation deepened. It wasn't only fear of consequences that unsettled him. It was the unfamiliar sensation of being ignored. Then the elevator doors opened. A group stepped out. 4 men and 2 women, all sharply dressed, calm-faced, with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to scan the room for approval. Their clothing was expensive, but not flashy. Their movements were controlled. Behind them walked a hospital administrator, slightly tense, speaking in low, respectful tones. 2 security personnel flanked the group, eyes alert, shoulders squared, not hospital guards but private security. Professional, discreet, and clearly trained to anticipate problems before they became scenes.
Dare straightened instantly.
He watched them approach, confusion flickering across his face. His first instinct was to assume they were there for him. People like that, he believed, came for men like him. He stepped forward as they neared Zainab's door. "Excuse me," he said, voice loud enough to draw attention, his posture shifting into the familiar stance of ownership. "This is my wife's room." The group did not stop. One of the women, sleek hair pulled back, eyes sharp, expression neutral, glanced briefly at Dare as though he were an unexpected obstacle. Then she looked past him to the administrator. "We're here for Dr. Zainab Adeyemi," she said. The name landed in the corridor like a weight.
Dare blinked.
"Yes, that's my wife," he replied quickly, trying to reclaim the moment. "I'm her husband, Dare Adeyemi." No one acknowledged the introduction. Not with a nod. Not with a greeting. Not even with the polite smile people offered out of habit. It was as if his words had fallen onto a surface that refused to absorb them. The administrator opened the door, and the group entered. Dare followed immediately, chest lifted with forced authority, ready to position himself as gatekeeper. But as soon as the first executive stepped inside, the room changed again. Zainab turned her head slightly toward the doorway. Her face was swollen. A faint bruise bloomed beneath her cheekbone. The bandage at the corner of her mouth caught the light. The calmness in her eyes did not match the injury, and that contrast made the scene feel even colder. The visitors froze. Not dramatically. Not with gasps. With silence. The kind of silence that arrives when people who understand risk realize they are looking at more than an incident. The sleek-haired woman's gaze moved from Zainab's face to the nurse, then to the doctor's notes on the bedside table, then back to Zainab again. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Ma'am," she said gently, "are you safe?" Zainab did not speak immediately. Her eyes stayed steady. She had spent years being asked questions that weren't really questions, questions designed to trap, to blame, to dismiss. This was different. This question carried weight. It was not curiosity. It was responsibility. Before she could answer, Dare stepped forward, laughing too loudly, too quickly. "This is being exaggerated," he said, forcing a casual tone that sounded brittle in the quiet. "She's emotional. Pregnancy, stress, a misunderstanding." The nurse's posture stiffened. The doctor's expression remained professional, but his eyes sharpened. The visitors didn't look at Dare. That was the part that broke something in him. The sleek-haired woman glanced at another man in the group, a tall executive with silver at his temples and a composed face. He nodded slightly, a silent communication passing between them. The third person, a lawyer, opened a slim folder and began reading without asking permission, eyes moving quickly over printed documents. "Who caused the injury?" the silver-haired executive asked, voice calm, not accusatory, but direct. Dare smiled again, nervous now. "Like I said, misunderstanding. She moved suddenly. She fell." The doctor spoke over him, tone controlled. "Her injury is consistent with impact," he said. "Not a fall." Silence thickened.
Dare's smile faltered.
The sleek-haired woman turned to the nurse. "Has incident documentation been filed?" she asked. "Yes," the nurse answered immediately. "And CCTV has been secured." Dare's head snapped toward the nurse. "What?" he barked, the mask slipping. The lawyer's pen paused mid-note. The executive's gaze finally landed on Dare, not with fear, not with deference, but with assessment, like a problem being measured. "I am her husband," Dare repeated, louder, desperate to restore hierarchy. "You can't just walk in here and interrogate people." The sleek-haired woman responded without raising her voice. "We're not interrogating," she said. "We're protecting an asset and a human being." The word asset hit Dare like a slap. He could not return. He stared at them, confused. Asset. The silver-haired executive looked at Zainab again.
"Dr.
Adeyemi," he said, respectful, steady. "We received confirmation that the deal closed. All signatures verified. Congratulations." Dare's mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. The lawyer flipped a page and looked up. "Given the circumstances," she said evenly, "we'll need to initiate protective protocols immediately. That includes limiting access to the patient and notifying the appropriate authorities." Dare stepped back as if the room had tilted. He had come here believing he was in control, believing he could bully a signature out of Zainab while she was weak and afraid, believing the hospital was a private space where his power would not be questioned. But these people, these sharply dressed strangers, were not family. They were not friends. They were not impressed by his name, his posture, his threats. They were connected to money, so large it moved governments. And they were looking at Zainab not as his wife, but as the person who mattered. Zainab's eyes met Dare's for a brief moment, not with hatred, not with triumph, with quiet finality, as if she were silently confirming what he was only just beginning to understand. Authority had shifted, and Dare realized, too late and all at once, that he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Dare recovered just enough to try again. He straightened his jacket, drew a breath, and reached for the oldest weapon he had ever trusted, money. "Let's be reasonable," he said, forcing a laugh that echoed too loudly in the room. "This doesn't need to become a circus. Whatever it costs to settle this quietly, I'll handle it." No one responded. He turned to the nurse, then the doctor, then the executives, eyes darting, recalculating. "Hospitals deal with situations like this all the time," he continued. "Compensation, NDAs. You name it. I'll sign." The lawyer didn't look up from her folder. "There's nothing to settle," she said. "There's only documentation."
Dare's smile collapsed.
"You're making a mistake," he snapped, the edge finally breaking through. "Do you know who I am? I will sue this hospital into the ground. I'll drag every one of you through court." The administrator stepped forward, voice calm, practiced. "Sir, threatening staff is not advisable." Dare turned sharply toward Zainab, desperation flashing. "Tell them," he demanded. "Tell them you slipped.
Tell them you fell.
This can still be fixed." Zainab lay still, eyes steady, hands resting protectively over her stomach. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Silence, now, was not submission. It was certainty. The lawyer closed her folder. "We don't need her testimony to proceed," she said evenly. A security officer entered quietly and set a tablet on the small table near the bed. The screen lit up. Footage began to play. No sound. Just movement. Dare entering the corridor fast, posture aggressive. The door opening without a knock. The sudden motion inside the room. Zainab's body curling defensively. Nurses rushing in after alarms. Time stamps ticked in the corner. Dare shook his head violently. "That proves nothing," he said. "You can't even see." The doctor stepped forward and placed a document beside the tablet. "This does," he said calmly. "Injury pattern, impact angle, swelling timeline, all consistent." The nurse spoke next, voice firm. "And we heard the argument. We responded to the alarm. Multiple staff witnessed your behavior." Another staff member nodded. "So did we." Dare's voice rose, cracking now. "You're twisting this. She's my wife." The lawyer met his gaze. "That does not grant immunity." Security shifted subtly, closing off the doorway. Dare noticed too late. He turned toward the exit and found it no longer available. "This is outrageous," he said, backing up, breath shallow. "You can't do this to me." Then the police arrived. Not rushing, not shouting. Two officers entered with professional calm, listening as the administrator summarized, reviewing the tablet, the documents, the statements. They nodded, asked precise questions, took notes. One officer turned to Dare. "Sir," he said evenly, "we need you to step aside." Dare laughed, a short, broken sound. "This is a misunderstanding." The officer didn't argue. He gestured again. As Dare was escorted away from the bed, his phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, calls from people who would soon stop answering. His reputation, built on intimidation and image, began to unravel not with scandal, but with process. Zainab watched none of it. She stared at the ceiling, breathing steadily, feeling the weight lift in quiet increments. She did not need to speak. The truth had found its voice. And as Dare's protests faded down the corridor, one reality settled fully into place. Power, when abused, does not disappear, it reverses. Zainab remained on the hospital bed long after the room emptied, long after Dare's voice disappeared down the corridor, long after the doors closed behind the officers who led him away. The machines returned to their steady rhythm. The nurse adjusted the blanket gently. Outside, the hospital resumed its normal pace, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had. The truth had surfaced. not through shouting or revenge, but through patience, preparation, and quiet endurance. But this was not the end of Zainab's story, because what happened inside that hospital was only the first collapse. The mansion, the lover, the public humiliation he planned, the secrets he never imagined she was holding. The consequences waiting beyond those hospital walls are far bigger and far more devastating than what you've seen so far. In part 2, you'll witness what happens when Dare finally returns to the mansion he thought was his, only to discover the full weight of what Zainab did in silence. You'll see how the woman in red reacts when power vanishes. And you'll hear the truth Zainab has not yet spoken about the child, the house, and the future she has already secured. Before you go, let me ask you this. If you were Zainab, would you have spoken earlier? Or was silence the smartest weapon? Do you think Dare truly understands what he has lost yet? And when he stands at those gates again, should Zainab forgive or let justice finish its work? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you don't want to miss part 2, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next chapter delivers the kind of justice that leaves no room for denial.